You step onto the stone steps of the Forum Romanum, while the early sunlight still lies thin across the paving, and the cries of merchants are only beginning to rise through the square. In your hands is an agreement now being recalled in two different ways. You remember a promise that was once spoken aloud. The man facing you appeals to another interpretation, and within only a few short exchanges, the air grows heavier in the most public space in the city of Rome. It was in moments like these that the Romans came to understand that standards could not rest only in memory, in social standing, or in the power of a few men to define meaning for everyone else. According to tradition, the 12 tables were inscribed on 12 bronze tablets and displayed publicly in the Forum so that the people might know them, invoke them, and compare claims against them. From that point on, law became a support for agreements, property, and honor. And if you would like to follow how Rome brought its standards into the light, subscribe to the channel and join this journey. After the first standards were brought into the light through the 12 tables, the deepest change was not that injustice suddenly disappeared, but that ordinary Romans began to gain a foothold from which to name justice. The 12 tables were issued in a context of conflict between patricians and plebeians, as an effort to create a written public code so that officials could not bend rules at will against weaker litigants. From that point on, law was no longer merely memory held inside the minds of those with the power to interpret it, a standard that could be recalled, compared, and argued over. Imagine a craftsman standing in the Forum, reading those lines not only with his eyes, but with the relief of someone who finally knows that his dispute has a shared language through which to enter judgment, even if the road remains rough, and justice has never been a gift that arrives early. But in Rome, not everyone living under the same sky stood on the same legal ground. Roman civil law in its original sense was closely bound to citizenship status, and that status determined the path a person could take in everyday life, how one might contract, under which procedure one might sue, and to what extent one would be protected. In its original form, ius civil was law for Roman citizens, while foreigners did not automatically enter that same legal framework. For ordinary people who were citizens, this was both a privilege and an obligation. Law gave them a recognized place within public order, but it also required them to live within the network of responsibilities that came with belonging to an organized community. Here, Rome reveals its true genius, not only conquering territory, but defining human beings in legal language. And when a society begins answering the question, who is who before the law, it also begins learning how to function at scale. Yet a crowded city, and then an empire trading everywhere, could not live by ius civil alone. When merchants, sailors, debtors, and sellers from many communities met in the same markets and harbors, Rome was forced to find a broader legal ground. From that necessity, ius gentium gradually emerged as a practical bridge, without erasing the boundary of citizenship, but creating principles more usable for commerce and disputes between parties of different status. In the development of Roman law, this distinction between ius civil and broader legal frameworks helped the system operate beyond the boundaries of the original citizen community. Imagine a transaction at a port. Goods have changed hands, payment has been advanced, and a promise hangs between two people of different origins. An empire would suffocate if everything remained trapped in the question, who do you belong to? Rome chose another question. By what path can this dispute be handled so that trade may continue to breathe? At the point where old forms met new realities, the praetor emerged as a hinge of practical justice. If the 12 tables were the first stone foundation of legal memory, then the praetor and the edicta of judicial practice were the mechanics that kept that door opening as society changed. The magistrate's power to grant or deny procedural remedies, and to shape the form through which disputes would be handled, exercised a profound influence on the development of Roman law. For ordinary people, this meant something concrete. They were not facing only an ancient text, but a system capable of response. As markets grew more complex, transactions more subtle, and disputes more intricate, conflict could not always be resolved by repeating an old formula mechanically. Rome did not abandon tradition. Rome learned how to steer within it. And in that space of flexibility, law began to resemble a living body more than a statue. But even a skillfully built system would be meaningless if ordinary people did not know by which path they were meant to enter it. Roman legal procedure developed through major stages, from legis actions to the formulary system, and then cognitio extraordinaria, showing that Rome continually adjusted the way disputes were brought to judgment. This is not a remote technical matter. For a merchant denied payment, a homeowner disputing a right-of-way, or a family divided over property, procedure was the bridge between private grievance and public recognition. Once a conflict was placed into an authorized form, it changed in nature. It was no longer merely a quarrel, but a matter that could be heard, weighed, and concluded by a ruling. Of course, status and money still created unequal outcomes. But what Rome achieved was the planting of a durable political habit. Disagreement did not have to end in retaliation. It could pass through process. From the court, let us return to the market, where law appears not in speeches, but in the rhythm of daily exchange. In the Roman legal tradition, the structures of contract developed with remarkable refinement, especially consensual contracts such as sale, hire, partnership, and mandate, along with other forms of obligation clearly recognized by law. For ordinary people, this was the invisible logistics of life. Hiring someone to transport goods, advancing payment, leasing land by season, asking someone to perform paid work. A society becomes truly stable only when repeated promises can enter legal patterns familiar enough that people can use them without trembling before uncertainty. Rome did not suddenly make people more trustworthy. Rome did something more practical, imposing a legal cost on bad faith and creating a path of recourse for the injured. Thus, Roman markets did not merely exchange goods. They tested the durability of law each day through money, time, and honor. And then, between bargaining in the marketplace and argument before the court, writing entered as the material memory of law. In the Roman world, legal writing was not simply record-keeping for its own sake. It carried the weight of evidence, commitment, and traces to which a future dispute might return for comparison. Not everyone could read, and not everyone could easily reach a scribe, yet the growing importance of written records changed how ordinary people viewed a promise. It no longer vanished the moment it was spoken. It could be preserved, reread, and cited again. Roman law as a system developed both through written law and through interpretation and legal practice across centuries. In ordinary life, that produced a culture of responsibility in which spoken words and material traces were increasingly bound together. And once a society learns to remember through writing, law begins to travel farther than any individual memory. If the market is where law keeps exchange from collapse, then the family is where law touches the deepest part of human life. The 12 Tables and Roman law more broadly both addressed paternal authority, family, property, and inheritance, fields that determined who belonged to whom, who managed what, and how far a life was recognized as legally legitimate. In the Roman world, the family was not only a matter of feeling, it was a legal, economic, and social unit. For ordinary people, this brought both structure and burden. Marriage was shaped by rules, children were tied to legal status, and property moved through mechanisms not entirely left to personal preference. Rome treated family order as part of public order, because the state understood that a society cannot stand if the most basic human bonds exist wholly outside law. Once law crossed the household threshold, it no longer merely settled disputes, it began to shape the rhythm of life itself. From the household threshold, the story naturally opens onto the streets, where law not only settles disputes after they happen, but prevents disorder before it hardens into habit. When we look at the Roman municipal legal tradition and the texts associated with the Tabula Heraclensis, we see something strikingly modern in the noblest sense. Rome understood that urban order was a legal task, not merely a matter of private morality. Streets, passageways, the keeping of movement unobstructed, things that seemed small were in fact the foundations of public trust. An empire could not pride itself on avenues and stone columns if citizens had to step each day through standing mud and stretches of road for which no one accepted responsibility. Thus, Roman urban law reached into the most ordinary parts of life. The roadway before one's door, the duty of maintenance, and the supervisory authority of municipal officials. Order begins where the citizen's foot touches the ground. And when a life reached its final stage, Roman law appeared with a quality both austere and deeply humane, the desire to leave order behind for those who remained. In the surviving fragments of the Roman legal tradition, there is from an early period a strong concern with inheritance, property rights, and mechanisms of transfer after death. For ordinary people, wills and inheritance were not simply about dividing possessions. They were the means by which a father, a widow, or the owner of a small workshop tried to keep the household from falling into disorder in their absence. Who receives the tools of labor? Who keeps the house? Who carries unfinished obligations? Such questions brought law into the quietest private spaces. And here, a larger door begins to open. If law could preserve order for a family after death, then by what rules did it preserve the living city of Rome itself? Its streets, drains, passageways, and the urban breath shared each day by thousands? In the surviving inscribed lines, we encounter a governing spirit worth lingering over. Responsibility does not drift. The Tabula Heraclensis in translation shows rules requiring owners of property bordering a road to keep the portion before them passable, while an edile supervised repairs and ensured that standing water did not obstruct movement. This is more than administrative technique. It is political philosophy in practical form. Rome did not wait for some anonymous someone to solve everything. Law attached duty to position, property, and office. For ordinary people, this meant something deeper than convenience. It made the city more predictable. Once rules of streets and sanitation were named, residents knew who bore responsibility, who held the power to compel, and where the boundary lay between private carelessness and a violation of common order. This was law as a map of visible responsibility. But Roman order was not organized only in urban space. It was also organized through the legal status of persons. Here, the Roman world appears in all its sophistication and in all its severe limits. Rights and duties were not distributed equally simply because people lived beneath the same Roman sky. Citizenship, freedom, or dependence, freed status, place within the family, altogether formed a legal map determining who could do what, sue under which procedure, own through what mechanism, and how far one's voice would be heard. This is something modern audiences must face directly. Rome's organizational power did not mean modern equality. It was a stratified system structured by law. Yet precisely because that stratification was given legal form, even if imperfectly, the society could function at scale, because people lived within an order whose boundaries of authority had, at least in name, been translated into legal language. In that landscape, citizenship carried special weight, not merely a proud title, but a key opening access to many protections of ius civil. At first, Roman civil law applied specifically to citizens, while foreigners stood outside much of it unless a suitable mechanism of protection existed. What did that mean from the perspective of ordinary life? It meant that the same dispute, the same debt, the same promise of sale could follow different legal paths depending on status. Rome, therefore, did not merely govern territory, Rome governed access to justice. That may sound severe, but it also helps us understand why legal status became a matter of survival within the empire. Citizens did not ask only, "Am I right?" They also had to ask, "Who am I before the law?" And that question, repeated across generations, taught Roman inhabitants to think of rights as a structure, not merely a feeling. Beneath the tier of free citizens, Rome also contained dependent conditions that the law recognized in a profoundly different way, and this is where the story becomes both more complex and more unsettling. In Roman legal tradition, the distinction between the freeborn, the enslaved, and the freed was not merely a social description. It was a set of legal boundaries that determined where a person could stand in relation to property, obligation, the courts, and the future of his or her own life. A free person entered legal life as a bearer of rights and duties. A captive, in principle, was placed under the power of another and did not stand on that same ground of legal autonomy. A freed person had crossed an important threshold, yet that freedom did not erase the traces of former status. Such people could still carry obligations of patronage and limitations not imposed on those born free. Rome allowed movement between statuses to a remarkable degree compared with many ancient societies, yet it still preserved the legal memory of one's origins within the structure of rights and obligations. For ordinary people, this created a very real world. Hope was real, but hope almost always had to pass through the doorway of legal relationships. In Rome, freedom was not simply a feeling. It was a condition recognized, classified, and bound by law. Returning to the family, we can see more clearly why Roman law could both stabilize society and press heavily upon individuals. The concept of patria potestas, the authority of the male head of household over descendants in the male line and adopted children, was not merely a custom. It was the legal axis of the Roman household in its broader sense. This was an extensive power in family law, and it helps us understand why the property, responsibilities, and legal status of many members converged in a single point. Rome chose to build order from family units with clearly structured authority, like smaller institutions nested within the larger one. For ordinary people, that system provided form and continuity, but it also demanded obedience. The important task is not to judge the past by modern standards, but to recognize Rome's organizational logic. They believed that a durable community required defined links of authority, from the private house to the public court. Yet Roman law did not stand still like stone. Even in marriage and family property, we can see shifts that reflect changing life. For example, the tradition of marriage without manus, which later became more common, preserved the separation of property between spouses and did not place the wife under the husband's manus in the older model. This is a legal detail, but its effects reach directly into everyday life, into control of property, into a woman's place within family networks, and into the way marital alliances were negotiated. Set beside the role of the praetor that we have already seen, it reveals a consistent thread. Rome endured not because everything remained unchanged, but because its system could absorb change while preserving a sense of order. For ordinary people, what mattered was not the scholarly name of the rule, but whether legal life could adapt enough for them to continue living, marrying, working, and arranging the future. And precisely here, we can see one of Rome's quietest achievements, turning law into the infrastructure of social trust. Not blind trust in persons, but conditional trust in a mechanism. People dare to pay in advance, deliver goods later, marry, write wills, and bring disputes to court, not because they believed everyone was good, but because they believed that when things failed, a shared language of judgment still remained. Rome built that language in layers: written law and custom, magistrates' edicts, legal procedure, written agreements, and the authority of officials. The coexistence of written and unwritten law in the Roman system is precisely what made law, for ordinary life, both legitimate and usable. This is the moment when law moves beyond command and becomes a social habit of trust. Of course, that trust was never evenly distributed, nor was it ever perfect. Poorer people might have had fewer means to pursue a case to its end. More vulnerable people might have depended on networks of patronage. Those living far from the center might have experienced justice in a rhythm different from residents in Rome itself. But it is precisely here that the durability of the Roman system becomes visible. It created a framework wide enough that these differences did not immediately shatter common order. From ius civil to ius gentium, from the praetor's edict to municipal regulations, from family to marketplace, Rome gradually wove a network in which people could predict the legal consequences of their actions, even if justice did not always reach ideal fairness. For modern audiences, this is a great lesson of institutional history. A durable society requires not only power, but power expressed as rules that people can learn, remember, and live by. From the bronze tablets of the 12 tables to roads kept dry for pedestrians, from the household under the shadow of the paterfamilias to the will that tries to preserve order after death, Roman law appears not as a theoretical edifice but as a breathing system of ordinary life. It did not erase inequality. It did not turn the empire into paradise. But it did something far more enduring. It taught millions of people across a vast world that common life could be organized through rules, procedures, and named responsibilities. That is why the stone ruins still speak to us today. They do not speak only of military victories or monumental construction. They speak of a civilization that understood true strength to lie in making ordinary people believe that tomorrow, their trade, marriage, property, honor was not wholly surrendered to the whims of the powerful. And from here, the story moves deeper into how Rome turned law into an art of imperial rule. Now that we have seen Roman law as the respiratory system of ordinary life, we can move deeper into the mechanics within that system, procedure. Roman legal procedure appears as a long development, with three major overlapping stages: legis actions, the formulary system, and cognitio extraordinaria. This is striking because it shows that Rome did not preserve a single fixed model of adjudication across the centuries, but continually adjusted how disputes were brought to judgment. At the level of ordinary life, changes in procedure were not remote technical matters. They determined how a debt, a lease, or a property dispute would be heard. An empire may be strong through its legions, but it endures only when ordinary people know that the door of justice does not change its hinges entirely according to the mood of those in power. Rome understood this, and for that reason invested in form. In the earlier period, the legis actions procedure bore a strictness so severe that it resembled ritual. Its process was highly formal, governed by tightly constrained steps. A case often began when the plaintiff summoned the defendant to court in public, and if he refused, he might be compelled to appear. To modern eyes, this sounds both alien and harsh. But placed within early Rome, its logic becomes familiar. In a society moving from custom toward public norms, form itself was a technology of trust. It reduced the space for arbitrary interpretation by requiring the parties to pass through actions recognized by the community. For ordinary people, the cost of such rigidity could be grave. A single procedural error might cost an advantage, but the reward was that disputes no longer vanished entirely into the fog of informal power. Justice began to take the shape of process. Then Rome moved toward the formulary system, and here the practical genius of the civilization becomes clearer still. In this mechanism, the magistrate, especially the praetor, did not merely stand as a gatekeeper, but played a central role in granting or denying procedural remedies and shaping the frame through which a dispute would be handled. What matters greatly is that this magisterial authority helped form jus honorarium, a parallel body of rules that at times even rose beyond older civil law. For ordinary people, this meant something concrete. Law was not merely ancient wording fixed in bronze, but also a system of remedies, legal paths of relief, opened or closed according to real circumstances. As economic life grew more complex, justice often lay not in repeating an inherited formula, but in choosing the right legal tool for the right kind of harm. Rome made that art part of the institution itself. And that is why its law possessed both discipline and breadth. In a later period, cognitio extraordinaria opened yet another logic. Instead of dividing proceedings into stages in the classical manner, more and more cases were kept in the magistrate's hands from beginning to end. This is generally understood as part of the post-classical period, after earlier systems had shaped Rome's legal habits for centuries. What matters here is not only the procedural name, but the political meaning of the shift. The empire was larger, administration more complex, and central power needed forms of dispute resolution suited to a new scale of rule. For ordinary people, the results could be mixed, greater convenience in some situations, yet also a fading sense of the more local, familiar mechanisms of earlier law. Yet even in this transformation, Rome's red thread remains visible. Disputes must be placed within an authorized form, not allowed to drift backward into private retaliation. It is institutional discipline in a state of evolution. If procedure is the skeleton, then the law of obligations and contracts is the muscle that moves daily life. Here, Rome was exceptionally subtle. In Roman contract law, alongside stipulatio, a promise form built on question and answer, there were also real and consensual contracts, and among the consensual contracts most important to ordinary life were sale, hire of things or services, partnership, and mandate. For ordinary people, this was not scholastic theory. It was the breathing rhythm of market, harbor, workshop, and household. An economy can expand only when repeated promises can enter legal forms familiar enough for society to use widely. Rome did not recognize every serious agreement as binding in the modern sense, yet the clearly shaped contract types it did recognize created a safe zone for commerce. Within that zone, structured trust began to yield value. Stipulatio deserves a longer pause, because it reveals how deeply the Romans understood the power of formal speech. Above all, it was a form of contract built on question and answer, originally quite strict. Both parties had to remain continuously present within a single act, by spoken words, and in its earlier phase it was tied to Roman citizens and specific verbal formulas. Later, these rules were relaxed, forms diversified, and by the 4th century written documents gradually replaced purely oral contracting. This opens a beautiful image in legal history. Rome moved from ritualized speech to memory materialized in writing, yet without abandoning the core insight that obligation must be clearly framed. For ordinary people, that evolution made life more flexible, without allowing it to dissolve entirely into uncertainty. Law did not merely hear what people said, they learned how to preserve their words. From contracts, we return to inheritance, but now at a deeper technical level, where Rome reveals both formalism and a practical capacity for correction. One of the striking features of Roman inheritance law is its complexity. An adult citizen could make a will, but only by meeting formal requirements, among which the appointment of an heir was central. In the Roman sense, an heir did not merely receive scattered assets, but became a universal successor, taking on the rights and obligations of the deceased insofar as they could be transferred. This is immensely important in ordinary life. A will did not only say who gets what, but also who bears which part of the unfinished order. A famous reform under Justinian held that an heir who prepared an inventory would not be liable beyond the value received. Here we see Roman law doing more than preserving order. It also learned how to reduce risk so that order itself could remain workable. And then appears the fidei commissum, an inheritance mechanism that shows how the Romans were not only skillful at making rules, but also remarkably adept at going around within legal frameworks when life demanded flexibility. A fidei commissum involved property, often through a will, being entrusted to one person with an obligation to pass it on to the final beneficiary, especially in cases where the final beneficiary could not directly receive the property in the degree the testator desired. This single detail says a great deal about Rome. When rigid rules met complex circumstances, society did not necessarily break. It could invent an intermediate structure. For ordinary people, this carried practical and emotional weight. A father, a patron, or an aging veteran could use law not only to divide possessions, but to arrange responsibilities and protect those standing at the margins of direct legal capacity. Here, law comes close to the ethics of care. When the empire entered the age of Justinian, that entire inheritance, old law, new law, juristic opinion, imperial enactment, had become so vast and tangled that even the state could scarcely hold it within a single grasp. Justinian came to the throne in 527 and faced a body of law full of contradiction, fragmentation, expensive copying, and even uncertainty of authenticity. In response, commissions were appointed to select, trim excess, resolve conflicts, and systematize the material into the Codex, Digest, Institutes, and the novels, the collection later known as the Corpus Juris Civilis. Ordinary people, of course, would not all have read those books. Yet the meaning of the project still reached them indirectly. The state was trying to make law less chaotic, so that public authority could judge and govern upon a clearer textual foundation. It was the moment when law became an infrastructure project of imperial knowledge. Looking back from the end of this arc, we can see that the original question, what did Roman law mean for ordinary people, has opened into an answer far broader than courts or text alone. It was the way a civilization turned power into process, exchange into obligation, the family into a legal unit, death into ordered transfer, and finally a chaotic storehouse of legal knowledge into a legacy that could be handed on. Roman procedure in its later forms helped lay foundations for adjudication in civil law traditions, while the Corpus Juris Civilis remained a long-standing landmark in legal history. Yet before becoming Western influence, that law had once been the rhythm of life for specific people. The market seller, the hired laborer, the wife, the father, the heir, the litigant pursuing a small debt. It is at that level of ordinary lives that Rome becomes most intimate and most worthy of reflection. At this point, we can see more clearly why Roman law did not vanish with the fallen arches of the Western Empire. Roman law did not exist only within the ancient Roman world. It continued to be used in the Eastern Roman, Byzantine Empire until 1453, and it shaped much of the Western legal tradition in lasting ways. This did not happen merely because of Rome's prestige, but because the Romans accomplished something rare. They turned lived experience, dispute, exchange, inheritance obligation into a structure that could be learned and transmitted. In their hands, law was no longer only the command of the stronger party. It became a craft of reason, in which concepts and procedures were arranged clearly enough for later generations to use, revise, and expand. For ordinary people, that power began in very small matters, and precisely because they were small, it endured. That is also why Roman law still feels familiar to modern people, especially to those who have lived long enough to know that society cannot stand upon passing emotion alone. A city may grow wealthy very quickly, but to live across generations, it needs mechanisms that let people trust that promises, property, responsibility, and disputes all have somewhere to return. In Rome, we have seen this in layer after layer. Legal procedure, contracts, the family as a legal unit, inheritance as the transfer of order. Roman law developed over centuries rather than standing still, and it was precisely this continuous development that allowed it to adapt to changing life. Rome was not perfect. Differences of status, condition, and power were real. Yet even within that imperfect world, it left a great lesson. Order must be designed, practiced, and maintained like a common civic work. So when we stand before Roman ruins today, we are not only looking at basalt blocks or broken columns. We are looking at traces of a civilization that tried to answer, through law, the enduring questions of society. How to keep power from becoming wholly arbitrary, how to keep exchange from sinking into suspicion, how to let ordinary people continue investing in tomorrow. And that influence did not end in antiquity. Roman law became a major source for later legal systems, especially in the civil law tradition. But if we speak only of Western influence, we miss the most important point of this series. Before it became an intellectual legacy, Roman law had been the lived rhythm of concrete human beings, the market seller, the hired worker, the father drafting a will, the widow preserving property, the litigant pursuing a small debt. At that level, law becomes civilization. Perhaps the deepest meaning of Roman law lies here. It did not merely define what was permitted or forbidden, but preserved the institutional memory of society. A durable community must remember which procedures are valid, who bears responsibility for what, which commitments remain in force, and which disputes belong in public space rather than smoldering into feuds. When that memory grows strong enough, social trust no longer depends entirely on the character of particular individuals. It is supported by structure. That is why the codification project under Justinian, an effort to systematize a body of law that had become scattered and contradictory, carried significance far beyond legal specialists. Even if ordinary people did not read the digest or the institutes directly, they still lived in a world where the state was trying to make legal language less chaotic. And when law becomes less chaotic, daily life becomes a little less fragile. But every great legacy leaves behind a shadow that must be faced directly. If Rome became so skillful in creating form, procedure, and institutional discipline, then did that very strength sometimes tempt people to mistake order is functioning for justice is complete? That question does not diminish the greatness of Roman law. On the contrary, it makes the legacy more alive, because it forces us to distinguish between a system capable of sustaining society and one that truly includes everyone within it. For all that Roman law developed, adapted, and spread widely, history also reminds us that no structure, however sophisticated, is immune to crises of power and the fractures of changing times. And that is the next doorway before us. When the empire begins to tremble, how much order can law still preserve? And who will be the first to feel the break when that invisible hand begins to shake?